In the first 4 years after its release in 1981, Trivial Pursuit sold 20 million copies. 4 decades later, that number is more than 100 million. This general knowledge quiz changed the industry and netted its creators Chris Haney and Scott Abbott a fortune. Many trivia games have attempted to replicate the success of Trivial Pursuit, but times and tastes have changed. So is there still a market for a great tabletop trivia game? I'm Adam Porter. I'm a game designer from Wales, and I've had a number of games released across the globe and more on the way. In this video, I'm going to show you the cleverest innovations I've come across in the trivia game genre and offer up some inspiration for developing your own. I received review copies of trivia games Roughly from the designer and CDSK from the distributor. Roughly is a light-hearted trivia game where players have to guesstimate this in terms of that. So how high is the Eiffel Tower in adult male ostriches? CDSK, or Curious Delightful Seasoned Knowledge, is a trivia game that asks you to be honest with yourself. How well do you know this subject? Too confident? Well, you won't go anywhere. Too careful? You'll be crawling. But if you answer just right, you'll zoom off to glorious victory. Both games will feature later in the video, so thanks to designer Ellie Dix and Hachette Board Games UK. In 1981, Trivial Pursuit designers Scott Abbott and Chris Haney did not have the luxury of the World Wide Web to scour for content to include in their game. So instead, they turned to books of facts. Fred Worth claimed that more than a quarter of Trivial Pursuit's questions were lifted directly from the pages of his trivia encyclopedia. He had planted deliberate, inaccurate answers, spelling mistakes and grammatical errors in the trivia contained within, in order to catch out anyone infringing his copyright. This was a common practice in dictionaries, encyclopedias and other reference books. The Trivial Pursuit designers fell into the trap and found themselves faced with a $300 million lawsuit in 1984. Abbott and Haney did not deny using existing books of facts as source material, but they denied that facts could be copyrighted, and they felt that their use was fair. The court found in favour of the designers, stating that the game of questions and answers constituted a totally different product to an encyclopedia of facts, and hence reformatting the content in this way was not improper. Worth's case was dismissed. As a side note, one of my strongest memories of playing Trivial Pursuit as a child is of spotting a factual error. I now wonder, after all these years, whether the error was deliberate. The question was, what is the name of the hippopotamus in the children's television programme Rainbow? My opponent correctly answered George, but the card stated it was Henry. And despite knowing my friend was right, I refused to concede. An almighty row broke out, game and board were hurled across the room, and a friendship was irretrievably damaged. For 10 minutes or so. Not my proudest moment. The sourcing of suitable questions is a substantial barrier for game designers looking to create a trivia game. Even with the internet at our fingertips, locating and formatting facts of an appropriate difficulty is a huge time investment. The original edition of Trivial Pursuit featured 1,000 cards, with 6 questions on each. That's 6,000 questions. We all know that trivia games are not easy to get made, for a variety of reasons that we'll cover later. So spending dozens of hours formatting facts is a risky endeavour when your game might never achieve publication. Even creating a workable prototype is an ordeal, and if you do achieve it, there's a sting in the tail. The likelihood is you'll never be able to play your own game because you'll know all the answers. Calibrating the difficulty level of your questions is not straightforward. Perhaps you want to divide your questions into easy, medium and hard. That's not easy at all, because the difficulty of a question is really in the eye of the beholder. A series of highly detailed questions about characters and events from the Disney film Frozen might be a piece of cake for a 6-year-old, but very challenging for an adult. Questions about cities in the United Kingdom might be super easy for someone who lives here, but completely baffling to someone who lives in the United States. If you read through Amazon reviews or Board Game Geek comments on trivia board games, you'll frequently find complaints that question difficulty is inconsistent, with some answers seeming obvious and others totally obscure. So what's the solution? Junior editions? Regional editions? It's all additional work and additional cost. And if we're planning to distribute this game across nations, it's not just a case of reviewing the content, someone's going to have to translate these 1,000 cards too. And while we're on the topic, 1,000 cards? Seriously? That's expensive to manufacture. Think of another game with lots of cards, something like Dominion perhaps. What's the retail cost? Well, it currently sells at £40 to £45. How many cards in the box? 500. Half the content of Trivial Pursuit, and no board or tokens. Trivial Pursuit, meanwhile, sells for around £30, a substantially lower price for double the content. Could we halve our card count? Are 6,000 questions really necessary? Well, yes. The latest Master Edition of Trivial Pursuit does get away with 3,000 questions, and the Junior Edition has 2,400. The budget option, Trivial Pursuit Party, has 600, and the user reviews are not surprising. Given the large and rapid rotation of the deck, the risk of catching the same question, even among 600 possible ones, is not so remote. If we want players to return to our game without seeing repeat questions too quickly, we do need a massive pool. And Trivial Pursuit doesn't waste space. 6 questions per card. Shrinking the font is not an option. This explains why trivia games often have the cheapest card quality in the market. Publishers need to cut corners somewhere. They're certainly not going to be rounding them. After you've put in all this work, all this investment, your work still isn't done. If this game becomes an evergreen seller, you're going to need to revisit that trivia for future editions. Trivia gets dated quickly. Kids are not going to be able to identify George the Hippo from Rainbow in 2025. Those innocent questions about a beloved pop star, DJ or newsreader might need revisiting now that they've been disgraced or imprisoned for horrendous acts of cruelty. Asking who is the President of France will yield a different answer in 2025 to 2015. And asking who's the head of state in Czechoslovakia might have made sense in the 1980s, but the country no longer existed a decade later. Okay, so it's hard. That doesn't mean it's not achievable, so let's dig deeper. Where does the fun in a trivia game lie? To get a sense of the appeal of general knowledge quizzes, it's worth looking outside of tabletop gaming and into wider culture. Television quiz shows are among the most viewed programmes on TV, with a dedicated following who tune in day after day, week after week, year after year. Pub quizzes are a weekly event in bars all over the UK, always drawing a lively crowd. People love a good quiz. The structure of television quizzes is helpful to consider because there are significant innovations introduced with each new format. But it's notable that very few of the board game implementations of TV quizzes are wholly successful. When the dramatic music and the lighting are removed, along with the audience and the cameras, and the actual game is viewed in isolation, the flaws in the gameplay start to become apparent. Who Wants to Be a Millionaire is a brilliant TV show, but as a tabletop game it's weak because it's a solitary experience. What are the other players supposed to do while one player works their way slowly through multiple questions? Downtime is a killer in a tabletop game. Pointless and Family Fortunes, or Family Feud if you're in the US, are really fun interactive quizzes, but they rely on surveys of the public to provide the various answers. This imprecision is frustrating to the average gamer, who's generally looking for fairness, appropriate rewards which reflect their skill and knowledge. The Wheel is a pretty generic quiz lifted by the interaction between players and celebrities. Are you smarter than a 5th grader? Is also based around interaction, this time between adults and children. The Chase and Eggheads pit players against known trivia experts. None of these relationship-based shows translate well to a tabletop format. A tabletop edition of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire cannot accurately replicate the tension of the time-constrained phone a friend option, or the reliance on a huge crowd of observers for the Ask the Audience lifeline. Many TV quizzes feature player elimination. The Weakest Link, for example. It's a great device to heighten dramatic tension for the viewers, but probably not such a great experience for the eliminated players. I'm sure the excitement of being on a TV set is compensation enough to offset any disappointment, but in a tabletop format, player elimination just doesn't sit well. In the board game of the popular British TV quiz, the 1% Club, players are tasked with solving increasingly difficult logic puzzles. If any player fails to answer the puzzle correctly, they're eliminated from the game, and the other players play on until one player remains, or multiple players answer the final question and split the pot. If one or more players are kicked out of a game before it concludes, they're likely to get bored and frustrated. It's not a great experience. The narrative arc and progression of a TV quiz is very different to most tabletop games. In a quiz like the 1% Club or Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, questions often start simple and tension builds as questions get harder and harder over subsequent rounds. The players gain greater rewards for answering harder questions, but each round is more of a grind than the last. This is the opposite arc to most modern board games, which tend to promote player progression and a forward momentum. Players build an engine so each subsequent turn is more productive than the last. Players achieve more and more as the game progresses, building towards a powerful final round. A board game generally feels easier as it approaches its climax, but a TV quiz feels harder. The reason TV quizzes don't translate easily into a tabletop format comes down to purpose. Who is the game really for? A TV quiz is designed primarily to entertain the audience at home. The players on screen are secondary. Even if their experience isn't particularly engaging, the thrill of being on a TV set likely makes up for it. A tabletop trivia game, on the other hand, has no audience. It exists solely to entertain the players, meaning the entire experience needs to be reframed to keep them engaged from start to finish. So as I've done before for numerous other board game mechanisms, deck building, worker placement, tableau building, roll and writes, racing games, I'm going to explore different approaches used by designers of trivia games, which hopefully might spark some new ideas for viewers wishing to create their own. Take these ideas, rework them, improve them, combine them, subvert them. Even better, look for gaps. What's missing in the world of trivia games? And what can you bring to the table which hasn't been done before? Now, a major consideration for all board game designers should be the experience of the player who's behind. Games are usually fun for the person who's winning, but what about the player in last place? We need to make sure they're having a good time too. The contrast in player experience between a strong and a weak player is never more pronounced than in a trivia game. In most strategy games, even a weak player will accomplish something on their turn. It may not be enough to keep them in contention, but they're progressing, and that keeps them engaged. In a trivia game, a struggling player might achieve nothing at all. Just one wrong answer after another, 0 points. Meanwhile, their opponents seem to have an endless supply of correct answers. Turns out Tracy's a walking encyclopedia. Who knew? Losing at a trivia game can be particularly harsh, and it's also exposing. No one wants to look foolish in front of their friends. If we want to create a successful trivia game in the 21st century, we need to ensure that everyone stays engaged, whether they know all the answers or not. Interestingly, most innovations in trivia games over the last few decades have focused on this very challenge. We'll explore several examples coming up. One way of enabling a more level playing field is to focus the trivia on a single subject matter. If the general knowledge is entirely focused around the TV sitcom Friends, well, players are forewarned. Not much point in playing if you've never seen the show. This reduces the audience for your product significantly, but potentially it provides a more satisfying experience for those who do know the subject matter. Examples of this include Hitster, where players identify songs from sound clips, and Blockbuster, a trivia game all about movies. Timeline is a trivia game which comes in many different editions. Inventions, British history, science and discoveries, music and cinema, so you can pick the set which interests you the most. Mattel's Bezzerwizzer, a German term for a know-it-all, is one of the more successful trivia games of recent years. This game features 20 different categories of question compared to Trivial Pursuit's 6, but in any given round you'll be tasked with answering questions in only 4 of them. The clever twist in the game is that you can arrange the categories in order of your preference. So if you're really knowledgeable on food and drink, for example, you can position that category in your highest scoring slot, while downgrading politics, a topic which you know nothing about. You also have tiles which allow you to, twice per round, jump in and answer a question posed to another player, and once per round, swap a category tile with another player so you get to answer the topics which appeal to you the most. These features allow players to focus on answering questions where they actually have a decent chance of getting the answer correct, rather than endlessly answering questions on topics they know nothing about. Most trivia games, including Trivial Pursuit, can be played in teams, and they're usually better for it. If you're working in a team, the pressure to answer questions correctly doesn't rest solely with you. You can contribute to a solution by discussing and reasoning with your teammates, even if ultimately someone else comes up with the final answer. Social interaction between teammates is central to pub quizzes, but noticeably absent from many TV quiz shows. Once again, it comes down to the purpose of the activity. Frankly, unless the players are celebrities, watching people confer on TV isn't very entertaining. But if you're one of those people doing the conferring, working collaboratively with teammates to solve a problem in a tabletop game, it's really entertaining. So long as there isn't an alpha player in the mix dominating all the decisions. More brains working together means more right answers, more positive player interaction, a forward momentum for all players, a shorter duration, and a tighter competition. And that sounds like a great manifesto for a strong trivia game. Teamwork is not, however, the only option for engaging players who don't know the answers. In Wits and Wagers, or Gambit 7, a European edition of the same game, questions all have numerical answers relating to measurements, quantities, years, etc. As a result, it's very unlikely that any player is going to know the exact answer. The goal is to identify a number which is closest to the true answer without exceeding it. It's an exceptional twist on traditional trivia games, which ensures that everyone is able to play. Timeline is another game where you don't need accurate answers. A ballpark guess is enough. On your turn, you have to slot a card depicting a historical event into a timeline, a row of cards laid out on the table in date order. But your card doesn't have a date on it. Once you've selected the right spot, you flip the card over to see if you're right. As the timeline grows, it becomes more difficult, but the beauty of the game is that you don't need to know the precise year that something happened, just a rough idea that it was probably before or after something else. You Must Be an Idiot requires some players to give correct answers and other players to give incorrect answers in order to score points. At the start of each round, players are given secret roles: Brainiac or Idiot. A trivia question is read out and everyone writes down their answer. Correct answers score points for Brainiacs, but a number of players are likely to remain with wrong answers. All players are then tasked with determining whether those wrong answers were just an unfortunate lack of knowledge from a Brainiac or a deliberate fail by an idiot. Players score points by guessing correctly who was an idiot, and the idiots themselves can score points by going undetected. So a key strategy is making your incorrect answer look like an honest guess, perhaps as close to the true answer as possible. In Fauna, players are tasked with identifying the native habitat of a huge variety of different animals. On your turn, you place a cube on the map to show where you think the animal can be found. Of course, there are multiple correct answers, but you also get a small number of points for placing cubes in locations adjacent to the correct spot. Players can also guess the animal's weight, length, and tail length, again by placing cubes. And once again, while putting your cubes in the right spot gains you the most points, there are still points to be had by placing cubes adjacent to the correct answer. Fauna is a great game for anyone interested in wildlife, but it was followed by other variations. Terra covers interesting facts from all over the world, and America focuses in on facts from that continent. An excellent aspect of Wits and Wagers and Fauna, Terra and America is that if you don't know the right answer, other players' answers can help you. In Fauna, you get to have multiple guesses for each question asked, and each guess is given in turn order by placing a cube on the board. So you can observe where other players are placing their cubes, and if they seem confident, or if all players' cubes are gathering around a specific region of the world, you can start placing your cubes in close proximity in the hope of picking up some points. In the game of Wolf, the active player is shown the broad category they're going to have to answer, but not the questions. They can choose to either go it alone and answer all the questions themselves, or bring in another player and work as a team. Either way, they'll be competing against the remaining players to score the most points from the category. So the game does rely on you knowing the answers to trivia questions, but also on having a good sense of which of your friends might know the answers. Wits and Wagers and Gambit 7 also allow you to score points from other players' answers. Everyone's asked a question with a numerical answer, everyone writes their guess on a dry white board, and then the guesses are displayed for all to see. The guesses are assigned different point values, with the numerical answer in the middle of the pack worth the fewest points, and the most fringe answers to either extreme worth the most. Players place bets on which answers they think are correct, increasing their chances by spreading their bets across multiple answers. And then when the correct answer is revealed, players score points depending on how well they guessed. In Half Truth, a trivia game by Magic the Gathering creator Richard Garfield and Jeopardy champion Ken Jennings, players place bets on multiple choice categories, 3 of which are correct and 3 of which are incorrect. Gambit 7 and Half Truth both incorporate a compelling push-your-luck element, always a hit in tabletop games, as evidenced by the massive popularity of Blackjack, Quacks of Quedlinburg and Diamont. In Gambit 7 you can either spread your bets, increasing your chances of landing at least one correct answer, though not all can be right, or go all in on a single answer for a riskier but potentially higher payout. In Half Truth, when you take a turn, you know there are 3 correct answers and 3 incorrect ones, so you can select 1, 2 or 3 answers depending on your confidence. More correct answers equals more points, but if any of them's incorrect, you get nothing. CDSK is entirely built on the premise of pushing your luck. On your turn, you're presented with a category. You choose the difficulty level that you'd like to attempt from 1 to 10. Answering a question correctly at a higher difficulty level scores you more points, advancing your piece up the track. But of course, if you're overconfident, you might end up with nothing. Half-Truth uses a multiple choice format. Not the most revolutionary structure for a quiz, but a welcome change from the straight question and answer format used in Trivial Pursuit and many other trivia games. Some games have strayed further from these generic structures, making their questions a little bit more interesting. How much does a hamster weigh in tea bags? In ballpoint pens? In grapes? What is the volume of a hot air balloon in whoopee cushions? In car airbags? In Zorb balls? These are the sort of weird questions you'll see in Ellie Dix's new trivia game Roughly. Players are tasked with estimating the size, duration or quantity of something by comparing it to something else. In the game Linky, one player reads out a series of questions from a card. The other players have to think of the answers, but they don't say them out loud. That's because the real goal is not to identify the answers to each individual question, but to work out a link between those answers. So if the individual answers were bread, republic, boat and split, the thing linking all those words would be banana. The first player to call out the correct link wins the card. Timeline Challenge uses the simple premise of the various sets of timeline, decks of cards with events on one side and dates on the other. The big boxed edition features a series of mini-games to play using these cards, which are compatible with all of the sets. One challenge requires players to position cards within the broad time periods illustrated at the top of the board. Another challenge allows players to make multiple guesses to increase their chance of a correct answer, or double down on one answer to increase their reward. A third challenge uses 2 timeline cards and requires players to guess the number of years which separates them. And another asks players to guess the correct year, scoring points for the right millennium, century, decade and year. There are also some bonus challenges to help players who are behind to catch up with the other players. It's a wonderful package of unique little trivia challenges. Now, while I've previously criticised the 1% Club for its use of player elimination, the question format is really fun. Each question is a logic puzzle and they increase in difficulty as the game progresses. 2 words with the same 5 letters in a different order can solve this code. What are they? The answer: bread and beard. One of Britain's most popular quiz shows of the 1980s was Blockbusters, and the accompanying board game was also a big hit. Each of the questions in Blockbusters is based on a letter chosen by the player. So if they select the letter A, the answer to the question asked would always begin with that letter. So for example, a question might say, what M is the best-selling board game of all time? It's a minor tweak on traditional questioning, like Jeopardy's central conceit of giving answers and requiring players to state the question. It doesn't actually do much to disguise the fact that this is essentially a straight-up trivia question, but it feels a little fresh. So where Blockbusters excels over many other trivia board games is in the actual gameplay. So in most trivia-based tabletop games, the trivia is the star of the show. The actual game mechanisms are secondary and often feel like an afterthought. Trivial Pursuit is just a case of rolling and moving around a track in an attempt to land on the right spaces and then get to the centre before the other players. It's essentially Ludo or Parcheesi with questions. In Linky, giving a correct answer means you collect the question card which has a letter on the back and you try to gather the letters to spell the word Linky. These are not compelling game mechanisms. Having a simple but enjoyable game as the backdrop to the trivia makes for a more engaging package. Consider the TV quiz Hollywood Squares, known as Celebrity Squares in the UK. Players are attempting to win a game of tic-tac-toe, but in order to claim a section of the grid, they need to give a correct answer to a true or false question. The celebrity shenanigans are really just set dressing and showmanship around a pretty solid little game. In Word Colony, on your turn you select a card from your hand and read the multiple choice question to the other players. They all vote on the correct answer, and if they're right, they draw cards. If no one's correct, you draw cards. The cards you've gathered each have a letter on them which can then be used to spell words. Subsequent words can use the final letter of a previous word as their first letter, forming a word colony. Individual words which aren't part of a colony can be stolen by an opponent by linking their own word to the pre-existing one. It's essentially a weird little mashup of trivia and Scrabble. One of the oddest games I've encountered in a while. Perhaps most disappointingly, the base game only comes with 440 multiple choice questions, less than a tenth of Trivial Pursuit. This is the downside of using a game mechanism whereby each card can only feature one question. In Blockbusters, players are trying to answer questions to control hexes on a grid. A correct answer turns the hex to your colour. One player tries to connect the top and bottom of the grid with a chain of hexes of their own colour, and the other players work together to make a chain from left to right, blocking the vertical player. It's essentially a simple abstract strategy game with trivia. Much more engaging. In my view, the core gameplay has too often been neglected in trivia games. Why couldn't trivia be used to determine how far a racing car can move in a racing game, the winner in combat in a dungeon crawl, or the price a player must pay for an item in a strategy game? It's less random than a dice roll, with far more opportunity for thematic questions. Perhaps I'm overreaching with the genres I've suggested, but blockbusters and Hollywood squares demonstrates that trivia and simple abstract games do make a great pairing. Blockbusters also excels in its presentation. Coming from Waddington's in the 1980s, it maximises table presence with a vertical plastic board reminiscent of Connect 4. Trivia games can feel a little bit dry, so it's nice when a game spices things up with some fancy presentation. Smart 10 is a nice example. The question cards are contained within a plastic box with a circular window at the top, and the top card of the stack is visible with a category and 10 possible answers positioned in a circle, each aligned with a plastic token. On your turn, you remove a token corresponding to an answer which you think is correct. Beneath the token is an icon to indicate whether the answer was correct or incorrect. Over subsequent turns, you can keep removing tokens or pass, but giving a wrong answer results in losing all the tokens you've gathered throughout the round. Timeline Challenge has beautiful artwork throughout, but the dials used by the players to lock in their answers are a real highlight, lifting the game above many other similar games and making it very tactile and appealing to play. Despite its academic gameplay, Trivial Pursuit is no slouch in the presentation department either. The wheel-shaped board with weird clip art drawings on each space is attractive, and the playing pieces mirror that wheel shape, and it's still novel that you carry scoring tokens, the game's iconic pieces of pie, within your playing piece as you move around the track. One issue with Trivial Pursuit is that it can take a long time to play, and it can be tedious waiting for your turn while other players contemplate a series of tricky questions with a run of correct answers. You can be sitting out for a while. Trivia game shows on TV often crank up the tension with speed rounds. A question's asked and the fastest player to answer scores the points. This is a particularly effective way of reducing downtime in a trivia board game. In Smart Ass, one player reads out a series of statements which serve as clues to a specific answer. Each statement gives a little more context and brings the player closer to the correct answer. I am a legendary hero. No one knows whether I really existed. Some say my real name is Loxley. I've been celebrated on paper, on stage and screen. In film I was played by Errol Flynn and Kevin Costner. I'm a loyal follower of King Richard. My girlfriend is Maid Marian, etc. I imagine most of you will have got it by now. The first to call out the right answer scores the points. Of course, a challenge with this format in board games is determining who was first when multiple players call out simultaneously. Game shows use electronic buzzers for this purpose, and digital implementations such as the Jackbox series replicate this very well. Not so easy in a tabletop format. Nonetheless, time pressure can be really engaging, even if not racing against other players, but racing against the clock. In Articulate, one player tries to describe as many words as possible to their teammates within a 30-second limit. In Stay Cool, players are asked two different, simple trivia questions simultaneously. One must be answered verbally, and the other spelled out with letter cubes. The goal is to multitask, answering as many questions as possible of each type within a short time limit. TV quizzes rely on a charismatic host to guide the game, explain the rules, and build tension. In a boxed quiz, these roles fall to the players, and that's a challenge. The questioner is a passive participant, reading out questions but doing little more. They're essentially a device, a component. A tabletop game needs to find a workaround to avoid sidelining such a player. The most common approach is for a player who isn't currently taking their own turn to read the questions. And this rotating questioner approach is logical, but it can be tedious, especially in games like Trivial Pursuit or Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, where one correct answer results in a player taking another turn. The downtime can be significant. Another common approach, as seen in the games Fauna and Terror, is for one player to read the question and then all players, including the questioner, try to identify the correct answer. With this approach, the designer needs to take care to ensure that the questioner doesn't accidentally catch a glimpse of the right answer. Stay Cool gives an additional job to the questioners, allowing them to use the questions to pester and stress the player whose turn it is, repeating the question over and over in an attempt to confuse them. The party game Huh? Also keeps the questioner at the heart of the action by asking them to invent the questions themselves. The twist is, as the questioner, your goal is to get some players to guess the correct answer, but not everyone. If no one gets it right, or if everyone does, you score nothing. For instance, a card might tell you that the answer is Titanic, and it's up to you to come up with a clue. You want it to be just cryptic enough, maybe something like, Jack goes on holiday of a lifetime, but ends up a little bit damp. It's a clever twist on familiar party game formats, clearly taking inspiration from the storytelling and interpretation mechanisms of Dixit. But it can be a challenge for the questioner who has to think creatively on the spot. If you've ever seen someone freeze during a game of Codenames struggling to come up with the perfect clue, you'll recognise that same tense pause in Ha. Seen It was a massive hit for Mattel in 2002, using DVDs to show video clips from movies and asking players to answer questions about them, effectively removing the need for a human questioner. Unsurprisingly, more recent editions have replaced the DVD with an app to deliver an equivalent experience. A similar approach is taken in the quiz game Hitster, which plays like a musical version of Timeline. Players scan QR codes on cards to hear short music clips, then try to place them in the correct chronological order before checking the dates on the back of the cards. In both cases, app integration replaces the role of the questioner, but also pushes the game closer to a digital experience. And frankly, if you're already stepping away from a fully analog experience, you might as well go all in and play Jackbox, an excellent suite of entirely digital trivia games built specifically for group play. And that's the real challenge. If you're thinking of designing a trivia-based tabletop game, you've got a lot of competition. Not just from video games, but quiz gambling machines in bars, pub quizzes, TV and radio quizzes, quizzes in magazines, puzzle books, and Christmas crackers. How is your trivia game going to stand out? So let's summarise. What is the arc of your trivia game? How can you introduce a sense of progression, giving players a sense of achievement and avoiding repetitive gameplay? Could you adopt game mechanisms from other genres, combining a solid game system with quiz-based play? How are you going to source your questions? Can you achieve a substantial variety of questions without blowing the production budget? How will you ensure an appropriate difficulty? Could you zone in on one specific topic or genre? Or do you want your trivia game to cover the whole gamut of human knowledge? How can you prevent the facts getting dated? How are you going to keep players engaged when they don't know all the answers? Can players specialise in one category during play? Can they team up with other players so the responsibility of giving a correct answer doesn't rest with one player alone? Are there opportunities for clever game mechanisms in those team interactions? Do you need to answer correctly to score points, or is a close answer good enough? Numerical questions lend themselves particularly well to approximate answers. Can players use their opponent's answers to guide their own? Perhaps scoring points isn't contingent on coming up with the correct answer, but betting on which answer is correct among a number of options. How can you add tension or increase the stakes? Push your luck mechanisms are particularly compelling in a trivia game. Does speed play a part? Are your players forced to race against each other or race against the clock? Could you improve your trivia game with exceptional table presence? Is there a functional, affordable device which could enhance the experience for players? How can you make the questions more interesting than the traditional Q&A format? Could you introduce a little humour? Or base your questions less on general knowledge and more on lateral thinking? Could your game have different rounds with different styles of questions? Who's asking the questions? Is one player sidelined as questioner or host? And how can you keep all players engaged at all times, empowering that questioner? I hope this has sparked some ideas for you, or given you some areas to reflect on if you're already in the process of designing your own trivia game. And if you're not a designer, I hope it's demonstrated some new titles which you hadn't heard of, but you might want to give a try. If you enjoyed the video and want to see more deep dives into game mechanisms, follow the link.